Everyone, and welcome back to ASA Live. My name is Dee Goldstein, and I'm the Senior Manager of Revenue Growth Strategy at the American Society on Aging. This is the third and final part of our series on living and dying with dementia. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 yet, we'll have those posts linked in the posts in the comments. Now, as a reminder, if you have any questions or would like to join the conversation, please do so in the comments section below. I would like to welcome back our guests, Compassion and Choice's National Director of Clinical Education and Engagement, Jessica Empeño, and America's Psychologist, Dr. Jeff Gardier. Welcome back.
Thank you for having us. Thank you, Jessica, for all the great information you always share and preparing us. You got to give credit where credit is due. Dee, thank you for your great interviews.
And Dr. Jeff, thank you so much for giving us context to the conversation that we're having. In last week's conversation, we discussed late-stage dementia, and we received questions about advanced directives and how people can plan for life and death with dementia. In today's conversation, I think it's especially apropos as it is World Alzheimer's Awareness Day, and it's a day that's meant to raise awareness. We know that it's so important to acknowledge the terminal nature of dementia, and part of doing that is normalizing the conversations and planning that need to happen when one is diagnosed. So let's dig into that. Jessica, what is advanced care planning and why is it so important?
I'm so glad that we're talking about this today because it is really important. Advanced care planning is a process that basically supports adults at any age, at any stage of health, in not only understanding, but sharing their personal values, their goals, and their preferences regarding their medical care. So the goal in this process is for people ultimately to be able to get the type of care that they want. And too often we don't have these conversations until a crisis is upon us. So this process of advanced care planning is something that needs to happen early before you need it so that you can have good conversations, get the information you need, and think about, what you want. And then we need to talk again when something changes, like there's been a new diagnosis or a change in a medical condition, so that we can make sure that we are always up to date on what your values and your wishes are.
Absolutely. And I'd like to add very quickly that it is so important that your organization, Dee, is doing this, and the incredible information Jessica is giving about the advanced directive, because one of the things we know is that 2 out of 3 U.S. adults have not completed an advanced directive. And, we are, considered to be a very industrial and forward-leaning country, but in many ways, there are many things that we still need to work on that is so basic, such as having an advance directive. If you can no longer make decisions about your health, if you're in a vegetative state, if you are, experiencing a terminal illness, that's why it's so important to plan in advance so that everything can work in a way that benefits you, and you're not getting needless medical care or being made to suffer or spending time or dying in an ICU when you can get palliative care, when you can get hospice care. So folks, listen up to what we're talking about today. An advance directive is something that you need to be on, and there's so many great aspects of it that Jessica and I will share.
Yeah, so it's definitely the more you know. But is this just an older adult issue? How old or young should you be when you start thinking and planning these things?
As young as Jessica and as old as I am. Go ahead, Jess. You were going to answer.
Yeah, really. Anybody over the age of 18 really should have these conversations, because, that's when we as a country say that you are legally allowed to make your own decisions. So now it's time to document what those decisions are. So.
Yeah, because look, I mean, I'm a senior citizen, and, I know that I have more years behind me than in front of me, but I'm still a very happy fella. But I know that my having an advance directive, and I've had one for quite some time, is something that is really mandatory for someone my age. Now, Jessica is extremely young. Dee, you're extremely young. We have a lot of people who are very young who are listening. You may not think, I know you all are part of the choir, we're preaching to the choir here, but a lot of young people don't think about death. They don't think about a chronic illness. They don't think about a tragic accident that can leave them in a coma, whatever the case may be. But life happens. We don't want these things to happen, but life happens. And when that fickle finger of fate falls upon you, you better be prepared.
Yeah, and so this is obviously a sensitive topic, and I think a lot of people shy away from thinking and talking about situations where someone might have to communicate these preferences on their behalf. Dr. Jeff, can you recommend a couple of ways or language that people can use to bring up this topic with their loved ones and initiate the conversation?
Sure, Dee, I love that question simply because, Jessica, as you know, we had a conference in DC and talked about this. It's never too early to have conversations about death. Death is a natural thing, whether it happens by some sort of accident, or you get an illness, or you live a very long life. We have birth, we have death. We say it from cradle to grave. That's part of life. We have to normalize these conversations, Dee, in our families, so that there isn't the taboo about it, so that people don't get scared. And as you said, Dee, people are afraid to talk about death, but it's part of what we should be discussing. The earlier, there's something called early intervention, right? We use
Hmm.
it for children who may have some challenges and so on. But I believe in early intervention when it comes to advanced planning, when it comes to your advance directive. Because the earlier you talk about it in the family, before you perhaps are on your deathbed, God forbid, it becomes not only normalized, but you can tell stories, you can plan it, in a way that is joyous. We make jokes about it in my family, and the reason I joke about death is because I want my children and my family to be comfortable around having those discussions. And that's what's missing in many of our families. It's like, oh, I don't want to talk about it. But you've got to talk about it. It is a reality.
Yeah, there's a phrase that gets tossed around about having a good death, and I think, like, just like what you were saying, having that planning, that open conversation really is a way to work towards having a good death.
That's right.
Jessica,
Planning equals peace. We say that
yes,
at Compassion and Choices. Planning equals peace. And the earlier you plan, the more peaceful you'll be all the way through, because you don't have to worry about if something happens to you. All of that is there for you.
absolutely. Now, Jessica, can you tell us a little bit more about what goes into an advance directive, and also who do you share it with?
Mhm. Yeah, so this is really important. So, when we refer to an advance directive, what we're talking about is a legal document that writes out the care you would want if, like Dr. Jeff said, there comes a time when you are unable to speak for yourself. And it's important that this is done early because this has to be done when you have the ability to, understand the risks and benefits of treatments, that you have those abilities to communicate and think through what do you want. So we had a really good question in the chat about, can I change my directive after I've lost that ability? And unfortunately, the answer is no. So that's why it's really important to complete these documents and have those conversations while you have the ability to do so. So, what documents are we talking about, right? Within an advance directive, there are multiple pieces, and the forms can vary by state. So you want to make sure that you're using the forms that are appropriate and going to be honored as the legal document that it is in your state. An important part of an advance directive is designating someone to be your healthcare proxy, your decision maker, your durable power of attorney for healthcare. These are all phrases that mean the same thing. This is your go-to person for making decisions if you're unable to speak for yourself. Now, who should that be? This is something to think about. A lot of people just assume that it's a spouse or it's your oldest child, but you really want to carefully, because this needs to be the person who can be relied on to honor your wishes and make those hard decisions if that's what needs to happen when that time comes. Advanced directives will also include things like a living will, where you can talk
Mm.
about, if I'm living with dementia and I get to the point where I'm no longer able to feed myself, or my disease has progressed to the point, I don't want to be fed. I want to be able to, do those things myself. I want to let nature take its course, for example. There are do not resuscitate orders. So, what are your wishes if your heart were to stop? Would you want artificial hydration and nutrition? So, all of those things. There's another advanced directive form that I want to mention too that is super important, and that is what we call a POLST. Now, this is another one of those that's slightly different in different states. There's MOLST, POST, but what it is it's a physician's order. And this is a form you fill out, but it's also something that you do with your physician. And it's really about having that conversation with your doctor about what you want. And then when it's done, the doctor signs it, which makes it a legal physician's order that's meant to follow you wherever you go. So if you go to the hospital, your POLST goes with you, and it's still a valid legal order. It's also the only type of advanced directive form that is recognized and honored by paramedics and emergency responders. So they are trained, and if you've seen a pulse, it's on Pulsar pink, bright pink paper. And we recommend people put it on your fridge, because if something happens, they know where to look and they will be able to honor your wishes if something should happen. So it's really important. Fill out these forms, but like we've been saying, even more important than that is have those conversations, so that if you don't have those forms handy, you still have that person who knows what your wishes are. The forms don't do any good if you fill them out and then put them in a file drawer and lock them away for 20 years. We need to be able to have those things out and available.
Yeah, so know exactly where you're putting them, and putting them in places that you want your family to be able to go to them right away. Having your portable medical order so the doctor knows exactly what it is that you want to have done. Gary Mills says, I'm part of the choir. I have an advanced directive. However, I realize I need to make sure my children are aware of that and know what it says. And Gary, I might add, know where the heck it is, because you don't want people running around trying to figure out where did you put these documents. So Jessica, we've got to point that out. These things, yes, on your refrigerator door, in a trusted part of the house that that your family have access to, and so on, right?
Absolutely. And that brings up the question that you asked too, Dee, and like Gary brought up is, so once you have these forms, you have them filled out, you got to share them, right? This isn't something that's meant to be done in isolation and kept private, right? The whole purpose of doing these forms, of having these conversations, is to share it, to make your wishes known. This is a gift that you can give your family, right? So share it with your physician, share it with your family. Like Gary said, make sure each of your children has their own copy, so that when that moment comes, everybody's able to grab it right away. So share it with everyone that you feel is important in your medical decision making process.
Dee, can you imagine how much psychologically this destigmatizes talk about death?
Oh,
Because
1,000%.
it just opens it up to the family. There should be no shame in your game. You're being empowered, and therefore they become empowered. And understand that if you, as parents, for example, have your advanced directive, let me tell you something. You are breaking that cycle of families who've never had one. Because if you do it as parents, your kids will do it, their kids will do it, and this is something that is good.
Yeah, that is so important. And I think it's also important to remember that the person who you're making your proxy should be aware that they're being assigned to be your proxy and agree to be your proxy because it's a very big responsibility and a very big emotional responsibility. And I will also say, I live in Florida. We are at risk of hurricanes for a good portion of the year. And I'm guessing your advance directive should be part of those emergency forms that you take with you
Yes.
if you evacuate.
Yeah, I live in Southern California, and as you know, we're prone to wildfires out here. And one of the things that I've learned to do is I have a binder, and all of our important documents are right there in that one binder, so that if we need to get out quickly, I've got one thing to grab. And so everything from birth and marriage certificates, all of the important papers in our lives, including my parents' advance directives, is in that binder.
That's really great.
Absolutely.
And now I want to go back to a question that we received, and um, David asked, who will judge my cognitive ability? So, furthermore, if you receive a dementia diagnosis, let's say you already have an advanced directive, and now you have this additional diagnosis and you need to make changes accordingly, at what stage of dementia are you still able to make those changes?
This is a really good question. I think one of the misconceptions about dementia is that as soon as you're diagnosed, that's it. You're not able to make your own decisions, right? You don't go from, being able to completely unable just overnight. So it's a very individual, what type of dementia we're dealing with, where in the brain, how advanced it is. It's very specific to that person. So it is going to be the physicians that will judge, is this person still able to make their own decisions? Do they, understand? Are they able to think critically about a situation? Is their judgment impaired by the disease? So usually that decision is made by a physician. Some people in their advance directives can actually dictate, I want, two physicians to make that decision to determine that I'm no longer able to make my decisions and now my surrogate will step in. So there's different options if that's something that's really important to you. But as clinicians in our field, doing that type of assessment, we have tools that we can use to help supplement our own judgment about that. That is a pretty common thing that clinicians do in practice.
That's really important. And I do want to point out that Compassion and Choices has hosted a 4-part webinar series on these topics. So you can check them out at the link in our comments if you want to learn more. There are also myriad resources available on the Compassion and Choices website regarding this. So,
and if I could, I would
yeah.
like to just highlight a couple of those resources because there are so many
So important.
options out there for advanced directives. And guess what? They're all free. I mean, yes, you can pay for forms. You can pay for, an estate planning attorney to put a whole plan together for you. But there are also free options. So like you said, Dee, at this Compassion and Choices website, we have a lot of resources where you can find all of these. But I also wanted to call out Prepare for Your Care is an amazing resource where you can either print out an advance directive among 11 different languages, or you can actually complete it online. Caring Info is also a really good resource that not only has advance directive forms by your state, but also has a lot of really good information about what is hospice, like we talked about last week, versus palliative care, things to think about if you're living with serious illness. And then I mentioned POLST earlier, and the National POLST Coalition also has a really great website full of resources, the documents as well. Those are also some really great resources to check out.
Wonderful, thank you. And Jessica, I'm assuming all of these are legal forms, so is there a need to get a lawyer involved? Is there some place where it's filed at a lawyer's office?
Good question. So, if you work with a lawyer to complete the forms, they will keep copies in addition to the copies that they give
Correct.
you. But, like I said, you don't have to use a lawyer if all you're doing is an advance directive. If you're going to be looking at things like setting up a trust, setting up a will, which I recommend, but for this purpose of advance directives, these free forms, what you will do is actually have witnesses. So, you can either use a notary.
Oh, we're having a
Is
few
she
technical
frozen?
difficulties.
Yep. So I believe she should be there. There you are.
Did you lose me?
Yes.
Yep, you're back. You were frozen for a while, Jess.
Sorry about that.
So you mentioned that if you,
Oh, and we lost her for a second. So let me
yeah,
just add on to what she's saying. Oh, she's back on again. Let me not add on to what she's saying. Go ahead, Jess.
Sorry. So, what I was saying is if you are filling these out, you can either use a notary or you can use witnesses to complete the form. And as long as your witnesses, only one can be related to you. So, you need to have people that are not related to you and people that are not involved in your care. So, you can't ask your doctor, you can't ask
mhm.
if you're on hospice. A clinician or somebody that works in a care facility, they can't serve as a witness. And if
Correct.
it's completed correctly, it is in fact a legal document.
Now, let me share that I once did my advanced directive, and then I changed it, upgraded it, because I have, so many children and looking at who I was going to change as far as the proxy as my kids got older and so on, who I ended up marrying. So, making that person, my proxy and so on. But I went through an attorney and upgraded everything. Mine is somewhat complicated because I'm like the old man in the shoe. I have so many kids, I don't know what to do. So I just wanted to make sure I had the financial in place. That's a big, big one, right, Jess? You want to have your financial plans in place, your advance directive in place, your wills in place, and so on. So, but if you just want to get started, go to Compassion and Choices and get your paperwork going. At least you know that you're empowered to move in the right direction. And there are certainly great forms, as Jessica talked about, for you to actually do an advance directive.
Now, what would happen if, say, you assigned a spouse or other family member, a partner, to be your proxy, but they ended up passing away before you did, and maybe you didn't have a chance to update your advance directive before being deemed incapable of making those changes?
It's a good question. So, definitely a reminder of anytime you have any sort of a life event, we want to update these documents. But if it's not something that you are able to do, understandably, most of the time when you're completing an advance directive, most of the forms will have a place for you to designate a secondary person. So that if your primary person that you indicate is not available, not willing, right? Sometimes people just say, I can't handle this right
Mhm.
now, and I'm going to defer to the next person, and that's perfectly okay. So, in your documents, having that secondary backup person to be your decision maker is part of that process.
That's
My
good to know.
advice is sometimes I see advanced directives where maybe somebody didn't want to choose between their children and they have two people acting together. And let me tell you, just in terms of reality and the situations that we find, I have never seen one of those that works well or works the way the person intended. They want these two people to work together to make decisions together. And that rarely works either because those two people aren't available at the same time to have a conversation, or they have differences of opinions and different understandings of what that person might have wanted. So that would be something to think about, is really be careful about who you choose and if it, indeed you want two people acting together that need to be in agreement versus having one and then a backup person.
Yeah, and that's deep part of that conversation. For example, if you do want to make one of your children your proxy, don't choose from the heart. Sometimes you have to choose from the mind because, as we know, there are some people who may be more fragile than others,
Hmm.
and when your time comes and then that person has to step in, do they have the emotional strength to be able to do it? So, those are all the things that you really have to think about.
And Dr. Jeff, along those lines, if let's say I am the child chosen to be the proxy, and as my parent is in the later stages of dementia, I'm finding it more and more difficult to think about that responsibility, that upcoming responsibility. I'm becoming anxious, distressed, depressed. What can I do? What are my resources as a proxy, a caregiver, and someone who's supporting this advanced directive?
Well, I'm sure Jessica can give us a more technical answer to that, but I'll talk, and please do, Jessica. But from the psychological aspect of that, um, becoming a proxy is not just something where you step into it and I'm ready to go. You have to make sure that you are prepared also. Just as we talked about last week and the week before about being a caregiver and making sure that you get the emotional support as a proxy, you have to make sure that you get the emotional support of friends and family. Because let me tell you, and I've seen this firsthand. There are some people who are proxies who made some decisions, and then they go back and they start second guessing. Should I
Mm,
have done this? Should I have done that? Did I move quickly enough? Did I move too slow? And so you can make yourself the guilt can really, really bring you to a state of real depression. So always make sure that you have the people supporting you as you support that individual for whom you're the proxy. And I know, Jess, you probably have a technical, maybe, answer to this as to if someone feels that they just can't handle it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think starting with what resources do you have available to you to help you make these decisions. It can feel like you're on your own and the weight of the world is on your shoulders, but that's rarely the case. So, is it family? Is it friends? Is it somebody who's been through this situation before? Is it the physician or the other clinicians? Who is part of your care team and your support system that can help you make these decisions? Also, don't forget to go back to lean on those conversations that you had with that person. What do they want? Right? Because sometimes we get so caught up in what we think is right, but
mhm.
what we're trying to do is honor someone else's wishes. And so going back to hopefully there's forms that they filled out, those kinds of things to, what tools do you have that you can use to help you with those decisions?
Jessica, great point. Great point. Great point. I'm so excited. I just want to stand up and give you, a standing ovation. Too often, D, what we find is when someone becomes that proxy, they start making decisions as to well intentioned, but as to what they would do. But we
Mhm.
always say, pick up someone, your proxy, who will speak in your voice. That person lives on emotionally, psychologically, and they speak as if they were you, the person who has given that proxy.
And this is why some people actually, if they have the resources, if it's an option available to them, you can actually hire a professional. You can hire someone else to be a kind of a professional surrogate and make those decisions on your behalf. So you're removing the relationship, you're removing the emotional part of it, and you're going with somebody whose whole job it is to honor your wishes.
Very interesting. And you've given us a lot of food for thought about things to consider in making advanced directives. Is there any scenario in which an advanced directive would not be followed?
So I actually have seen some literature, and Jessica, you're the expert on this, so correct me if I'm wrong. But we found some situations where perhaps the physicians, and not to malign anyone in any way, if they don't totally understand the advance directive, or the advance directive is not available to them. That's why we talked about, the portable orders that Jessica talked about earlier, that they may not honor it out of ignorance, not really knowing what it is that you want, even though you have an advance directive, but it may not be there. And Jessica, you gave that eye look, so there's something I know you want to share about that.
Yeah, this is a tricky question because, like you were just saying, there are situations where advance directives aren't followed because people don't know, right? They haven't seen them, or sometimes they're so complex. If you're giving somebody a 30-page advance directive, that's hard to follow. I want to highlight the comment that was made in the chat too from the Wisconsin Dementia Network. If you're not using the correct forms, the legality of the forms, or if you've moved states, right, and you didn't update things. So there can be situations like that where there can be some challenges in honoring it. We also know there are times where the decision maker will make their own decisions and maybe not go by what was on the advance directive. So there can be situations where advance directives are not honored. That shouldn't be the case, right? These are legal documents and they should be honored, but there definitely are situations, crises and things, impact our decision making. And so things happen in the moment that may not be what we planned for or what we want, but it does happen.
And I believe there are many states who actually shield physicians if they may not be following it to the letter of the advance directive. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but especially in a case where they may not completely understand the advance directive, or may not see it in its totality, and I think we're being nice about it.
Yeah, so another important reminder to think about these things early, document them correctly, and talk about them frequently.
Yes.
Any final comments as we wrap up our three-part series on living and dying with dementia?
Dementia is a challenging thing to live with. It is something that many people fear, but the more you know, the more you understand, the more you plan, the less scary it can be. Arm yourself with resources, talk to professionals, don't isolate yourself. Get that help, get that support, whether you're living with it, worried about it, or caring for somebody that is living with dementia. Planning ahead, everything we've talked about today is really important, and we can't stress that enough. Whether you're living with dementia or not, we are not getting out of this alive, right? We have 100% mortality rate in this world. We have to talk about it. Everyone has an opinion of what they want that end of their life to look like, but it's hard to bring up. It's scary. We don't want to make other people seem sad, or, that kind of thing. So have those conversations. Even if it's hard, talk about it.
And I would say, even if you're not ready still to do your advance directive, take a look at the resources that Jessica talked about, that we've posted here. Just get the knowledge. That's a beginning step.
Yeah.
Now, to help put all of this in context, ASA and Compassion and Choices have put together a fantastic digital exhibit that'll take you on an in-depth and personal journey of living and dying with dementia, as told by those who experience it. You can check it out now on the Generations website, where you will also find Compassion and Choices useful tools for those suffering from dementia and their families. Thank you again to Jessica and Dr. Jeff for their insight on this important topic. And thank you to Compassion and Choices for partnering with us to provide this information. And I want to thank you, our audience, for joining us on all three of these lives. Let's continue the conversation in the comments and beyond. Thank you, everybody.